So did you always use the podium below at Kirkland, or did you use the big podium above?
Oh, no, I use the regular big podium
You did
above.
use regular big podium.
Unless I'm teaching a class in which I try to get down closer to the audience. Just always like to be as close to my audience as I can be. It just seems a little bit more personal. And
That's good.
sometimes I think you're up there giving a sermon, which is basically a speech. And sometimes I think people think they're watching television because they're, doing like this with their nails, and they're, carrying on and obviously not paying attention. And, oh, with the baby, and I'm thinking, I can see you. It's kind of rude here, not even making an effort to follow along.
Just a little bit. Yeah.
You want them to be in the splash zone.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
It is funny, though, the way over the years I've just noticed that a lot of people seem to tune out. And more. Now, sometimes people are on their phones, maybe looking up another version or something. You never know these days. It could be something that's relevant, but I think a lot of times they're just checking their messages or surfing the web and biding their time for me to finish. That's discouraging.
Yeah. I use pretty much my phone for the Bible.
Really?
Yeah, it's super quick up there. I don't know. And then it's also connected to my laptop. So if you're teaching or someone's preaching, I can make a note, and then later in the week, I have that note there.
Yeah. I don't want to judge because sometimes it may be relevant, but I had a lady once I had this series on the 7 churches of Asia and had a lot of historical documentation and all that. And I was intrigued by it. I learned a lot, and I thought they were really interesting lessons. And she was a fairly new convert, and she said, I hate to be blunt, but I can't follow you. I'm not really getting much from these messages. And I said, really? I said, I give you an interactive outline, so if you ever lose your place or whatever, you can go right back and you can see kind of where I'm at. It's always 3 or 4 points. And so it turned out that every time I would say something about Laodicea and something in regards to the hot and cold and where that came from historically. And so she would start searching that, and she'd want to follow up. Well, she's not paying attention. I've moved on to something else. And then she tries to key back in, and she doesn't know where I'm at because she's been chasing these rabbits. So I just begged her. I said, please don't do that. I said, you can't follow because you're allowing yourself to do all this research right in the middle of the message. If you want to make a little note and do research later, fine, but please just stick to the message. I think you'll like things a lot better. And she became one of my biggest supporters.
Oh, that's good.
It was amazing how she didn't think through how that would be distracting to her. And I'm not going to stop and wait for her to be finished with her Google search about something I said, And but she hadn't been in church all that much, and she hadn't really thought about that.
Yeah.
So it takes all kinds.
It does. It takes. Sometimes that happens to me too. I mean, you're talking about something or a familiar verse, and I'm like, oh, that would make a great lesson. I got to write that down, and then that makes me think of something else, and then I'm like, oh, I gotta bring it back. Yeah. It works out.
They're only one page, but the congregation at Kirkland, they would walk in, it would be on the round table.
Really?
And they're just really used to getting an interactive outline. To say interactive is because I want you to listen and then fill in at least a few of the blanks to kind of keep you engaged. And some of the kids, they fill in the blank. And then down off to the side, I have a word bank. And most of the time the answers are obvious, but I'm not trying to make this where you stump someone or they're listening to a sermon and, again, they're distracted because they have to figure out a hard answer. It's just a matter of engagement. And I also think, as someone who studied communication, that, there's 3 types of learners. There's most people these days are visual learners. That's why people like PowerPoint.
Interesting.
And so if you're a visual learner, then you learn so much better if you can see something. So that includes seeing an outline when you kind of get your orientation toward the topic. And then somebody else, a lot of folks are oral learners, where they just are fine with the lecture. They don't need to. And then I'm somewhat of a kinesthetic learner, which means I remember it so much better if I'm writing something down. I found that if I have a book and I'm highlighting and writing in the margin, that I'll remember that 30 years later. I can kind of see it in my mind. It's amazing. I'll go, I know where that is, and I'll pull the book out and boom. It's just something connected with the writing. So I like to take notes, even if I'm not going to save the notes. I just remember it better if I can write it. Wow. The movement with the seeing and the hearing. So they've done all this research. I forget what all the percentages are, but certain percentage of material comes in on the visual, some on the oral, and then some on the kinesthetic. And if you can combine all three, you're speaking, you can look at the PowerPoint, you can write and fill things out, then you're much more likely to remember the material longer. And maybe, if you really luck up, it goes into long-term memory if it really makes an impression, which is obviously what you want.
I taught at the collegiate level a little bit.
Oh, good.
It's interesting because when you do a little bit of study about pedagogy, the teaching of teaching,
yes,
that's very much in the vein of how do you really connect synapses in the brain. And when you mentioned this parishioner that you had, giving her the tool to be able to follow the lecture rather than the tool bag that she brought to the table. It's about, my mentor used to say, having another arrow for the quiver.
Yes.
And I've always loved that because it's a really brilliant way of saying it's just another tool to be able to access interaction with God's people. Like a Bible class that you experience for the first time in a topic that, maybe you've heard the same verse over and over and over and over again, and then it's just said in a certain way that rings so true in my head and my heart. For the Laodicea thing, that is such an amazing topic to discuss, to have hot and cold. Well, what are you talking about? Hot and cold, lukewarm, and you're in Revelation, so that's a little bit of a mystery too until you are exposed to it a few times. And then you say, wait, this is different types of water? What is that? And so you almost want to pull out the phone and do a little bit of research. And but then I suppose to fault you for, well, you're just not a good teacher. I can't follow you. I don't know. Maybe that was her bad. But I just remember certain lessons where I say, stop. That was the most amazing thing I've ever heard. But we're so used to being able to pause a video or pause a stream. My kids are so funny because they refuse to pause the video that they're watching or a movie, say. And, I came up with television where you wait till the commercial breaks to go take care of your business. Go pop the popcorn, go what have you. And my kids are just, hey, will you take the trash out real quick? No, but I don't want to miss this. Okay, well, pause it.
It's so easy now. You can do that.
It's not a big deal. And so it's to then go back into an interpersonal community where you can't press pause. You might not necessarily have all those arrows in that quiver quite yet. And so that's interesting to be able to interact with people in a certain way and say, wow, how do you reach someone? I guess as preachers, you are teaching, and obviously you're passionate about your subjects, which is God and converting people. How do you reach out to people who either are just brand new in the faith or maybe on the fence? Or I guess my final part of the question is, how do you reach someone who's been a Christian their whole life? And how do you weather the variety of the people that you are employed to reach and to inspire to follow God?
I gotta let the master answer that question, huh?
Well, I'm not any kind of master.
Because as a teacher for collegiate, you might get the occasional adult, someone who's in their 40s or 50s, say, going back, or even 30s. But most of the time, your students are a typical age, 18 to 22, or if you're a grade school teacher, you're 16, 14, 12, whatever grade you teach. But y'all are teachers of men, teachers of peoples, of all ages.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it has to do, with relationships. You just got to build a lot of different relationships with different people.
That makes sense because Paul's letters typically end with, hey, all these people say hey, and tell these people what's up, and make sure you bring me my coat.
Yeah, that's right. But he also says I'm also all things to all people. And, I got to take that to heart and see where they're coming from. And, I don't know, I feel like if the 18-year-old or the teen wants to play spike ball, you play spike ball, pickleball. And if the older person wants to talk about his life, and you listen, and maybe you can interject some scripture to teach in that moment. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think you're talking about two different things. You're talking about trying to get people to be receptive and open by meeting them where they're at, which is certainly true and so important to do that first by building a friendship bridge.
Yeah.
And, we do have some examples of Jesus talking to the woman at the well. Mm-hmm. And that was a stranger, and he just, opened up a conversation on something that they were both dealing with right then, which was drawing water from a well and drinking. And, but my experience has been, I've had a little success in talking to a waiter or waitress that I've never met before. Or one time I had a conversation with a lady on a plane. It's about 25 years ago now. And she was really interested and just pumped me with questions, and obviously a seeker. And so we exchanged information, and we got together again after we got off the plane, and baptized her at the Temple Terrace Church of Christ. Mm-hmm. And she was actually from Pennsylvania, and so I tried to set her up with a church in Pennsylvania. And no communication or knowledge of her or who she was before we happened to be randomly sitting on a plane. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying there aren't occasions where maybe it's worth the effort, or you might be someone that plants a seed and someone else comes along later and waters. But for the most part, if you've got some sort of rapport developed, some sort of trust, a little bit of a friendship bridge, where you serve them, they can tell that you're genuine, you really care about them, not just as a future convert, but as a person, then they're much more likely to be open. So that's one discussion, and we're going to talk about building a friendship bridge tomorrow in the sermon. But I thought you were saying, okay, here you are teaching a lesson, maybe 40 minutes worth of material. You got all these different people in the audience, and how do you relate to all of them that maybe you're not necessarily collegiate,
Sure.
And so you do need to try to have some awareness. When you have a lot of kids in the audience, I try to think of maybe a couple keywords, and I say to the children, why don't you listen for these keywords and see if you can't pick them up, and then tell me afterwards at the door how many times I use this particular word. Mm-hmm. So that keeps them engaged versus coloring. Mm-hmm. I think we make a huge mistake sometimes in focusing in on you need to be quiet. Mm-hmm. And so you can color, or you can bring puzzles or knit, or all these crazy things people do, but at least they're occupied and quiet.
Right.
And then as they get older,
you're laughing because you don't have kids yet.
Yeah, as you get older, when they really can pay attention and follow along, they're into this mindset of, this is when I disengage. Mm. This is when I just stay quiet and don't bother anybody. And so there's the temptation to just watch the phone or scroll through whatever, and they never really learn to engage. And I think parents make a huge error in not early on teaching their children to sing and to follow along the best they can, or maybe take notes or something, because no wonder as soon as they get old enough, this is boring, I'm not a part of this, they're not even really engaged. Mm-hmm. And, making sure that they're listening, driving home, talking. What did you think about that? What did you get out of that? Involving the children in some way, which is hard if you're trying to have something up here that's going to challenge some knowledgeable adults, So you've got the challenge of some people are pretty knowledgeable, some people aren't. You've got the age gap, just basic knowledge. I've had a little bit of challenges at times. I don't ever try to use big words just to use big words, but you talk about hermeneutics. I don't realize it. That's such a common word to me, the science of Bible interpretation, but a lot of people in the audience have no idea what you're talking about. So if you're using words that may have some sort of more theological meaning that people are not into that world, better make sure you stop and define it. So be aware of people going like this or something and try to respond to your audience. If you can tell they haven't got the point, maybe you need to illustrate it again, and they need to sense that you're responding to them rather than just reading notes off a page, So, there's just a lot of things to think about, and you have to ask yourself, who am I trying to reach? And what do they need? And what is going to best impact them? And, I have some preacher friends of mine like Ralph Walker who doesn't care for PowerPoint because he wants to connect with the audience and make eye contact. And the risk, if you have too much on your PowerPoint, is you're just narrating slides. They're looking at the slides and not looking at you. D. Bowman, by the way, he also rarely would use PowerPoint for that very reason. And I've thought a lot about that. And I think it depends on, is your focus disseminating information and teaching things, like so they'll be ready for a test, which is the situation I was in when I was a college professor? Or are you trying to storm the will and you're just trying to prick their heart in some way? Well, then too much information can be overwhelming, and it's more an intellectual thing than something of the heart. So, what you're stating here is a challenge, and you can't be all things to all men at all times. Somebody may love a lesson, it connected with them, and somebody else, I didn't get much out of that. A lot of it depends on where they're coming from.
Yeah.
But, when I was a kid, I'd hear, believe, repent, confess, to be baptized. And I remember I used to think, why do you even have hear on there? Because obviously we all hear, and if faith cometh by hearing and hearing by the word of God, then to me that was like superfluous. Oh, how naive and wrong. What Jesus would say, he that has ears to hear, let him hear. He's not talking about the ability to hear a message. He's talking about the fact that you're open, that you're listening, that you're paying attention, you're seeking. And I've come to understand that the hear and the hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized, instead of being superfluous, it very well could be the most important element. Is the person open? Do they have a heart that is receptive? Are they seeking? If not, you can give them all the great information about Christ and his deity and all that. It's not going to resonate unless they're open. And so that's what the parables did. They piqued interest. They got people to seek. They whet the appetite. And that is so critical in teaching, especially children. You got to make it interesting, whet the appetite, instead of just discerning information. And I think most people relate to some PowerPoint, but not too much. Otherwise, it's boring. I saw somebody once have all these detailed PowerPoints, and they just basically read off the slides, never made eye contact with the audience, and didn't connect, even though it was good information. So, sometimes you educate, you want to teach on a subject, and sometimes you want to prick the heart. And so you approach the material differently based on what your, objective is.
That's very similar to what we've tried to do with this medium that we've done with the podcast, is what you were talking about with hearing. Is your heart open? And it seems that from my experience, the times that I've gotten closer to God, or that I've felt like I've needed God more in my life, or that I've opened my heart more, is when I'm at my lowest. And I think that is probably oftentimes when people are seeking.
Yes.
that they have hit rock bottom effectively, and they have no one else to turn to. Their life's a mess. Who are they going to turn to? And that's when they're perhaps able to hear. If you have eyes to see and ears to hear. That's such an amazing point. What do you think, George?
I don't know. That's some interesting stuff. Taking notes myself, trying to figure out, I could do that. I don't know. I just feel like on Sunday I just try to do my best, and sometimes it lands, and sometimes it doesn't land. I don't know. So I don't know. I could take some wisdom from that. Just Sunday, I used a PowerPoint Sunday morning, and Sunday night I didn't use a PowerPoint. Probably because I didn't have time, but I felt like it was in some ways more effective to not use a PowerPoint as well, at least for that message.
Yeah, it depends on the message.
Yeah, sure. I think you're right. And I also think sometimes it depends on the speaker as well. If you're forced to use a PowerPoint and you're just not that type of speaker, you can, as you said before, and I've seen it, just end up reading your notes off that PowerPoint. Whereas maybe you're type of speaker that just, doesn't need that handicap. I don't know. But I guess what I also like is I also like having multiple speakers because you're able to impact a bunch of different people, Some people will resonate with Nate, Brent, me, John, and all at different times too. And I like what you said. You can't be all things, all people at all times. But if you have multiple people, then maybe you can reach more people.
I think there's in the Bible, I think of Hosea and Amos.
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't ask for two prophets that were more different.
That's a good point, yeah.
I mean, but they're preaching basically to the same audience in the same time.
Good point.
So God, through the Holy Spirit, sends them both.
Mm-hmm.
Amos is this knock them up by the side of the head, turn or burn, calls the women a bunch of fat cows.
Yeah.
Talk about politically incorrect. What? That doesn't sound like that would be appropriate. You're supposed to, in the New Testament, you're supposed to treat people with gentleness and be kind and patient toward all, apt to teach,
Yeah.
What's this fat cow stuff? But apparently there are some people that their hearts are so hardened that sometimes, it's like breaking up the fallow ground, the hard ground after a winter freeze, and it's the springtime. Man, you got to go up with a plow that is just so powerful to get through the fallow ground. And sometimes people's hearts are that way. So I think Amos is there kind of trying to break up the fallow ground. One last chance, kind of John the Baptist, turn or burn type preaching. And he had some response.
Sure.
And then on the other hand, you have Hosea, who's kind of like this compassionate, you're breaking God's heart. What are you doing? I know what it's like to deal with unfaithfulness because I married this woman by the name of Gomer. That was his first mistake. Marry a woman named Gomer. No thanks. But at any rate, God told him to marry Gomer, and she turns out to be unfaithful. And he goes through all this suffering in order to impact his message so he can relate to the people about how God feels when they're unfaithful to him. I think, wow, talk about
commitment.
Yeah, I mean, what God put him through just so he would be an effective speaker. Mm-hmm. Wow, what is he going to put us through so we can relate to people? That's kind of a scary thought. But, other people, they had more tender hearts, and they responded to Hosea. So it's not that there's only one approach, which is the correct approach. Mm-hmm. It's that there are different approaches at different times that work for different people. So over the years, I used to try to figure out, okay, now what's the best one way to preach?
Sure.
And I figured out probably the best way is to not do it one way, to try to change it up and an occasional focus on judgment and all of that, which, generally is not responded to very well in our culture. But if you're going to preach the whole counsel of God, an occasional lesson about that is in order based on what God did with Amos and Hosea. Not because I enjoy doing it, because I'm trying to mimic what I see the Holy Spirit has done. And then But having a variety of speakers kind of gives you different approaches, and I think there's value in that variety. Mm-hmm. And it's nice that older, bigger congregations now are starting to have 2 and 3 preachers to give different perspectives.
Yeah. Well, also you preached in Kirkland, which is in Seattle, and then you're now in Florida, is that right?
Yes.
And that's, I imagine, 2 different audiences. Outside of I know they're both Christians, but you know what I mean. There's 2 different areas with
2 different communities.
People. Yeah, communities is a good word.
The Christian family is very similar, actually.
That's what I meant. Yeah, that's a good way of saying it.
But with our visitor flow and their reaction to things, very different. I don't run into very many atheists in Tampa.
I wouldn't imagine.
But like Seattle is a center for atheism, and it's like the biggest audience for the National Atheism Society, and that's where they have their meetings.
Is it really?
Yeah. So, there's a lot of folks who have that worldview, and that changes everything. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, you have to be aware of that, and there's not many atheists that will come to a service. Mm-hmm. And if they do, it's usually because maybe they're either dating somebody that's a Christian and they want to be with them, and that's why they're there, or maybe they do have some sort of inkling that I want to see what the other side would say. But it does seem to be there's a polarization, and it's hard to get very many people from a really different secular perspective to even bother to come to a church service. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A lot easier in Tampa. Mm-hmm. But I think that's partially because you just have, percentage-wise, more believers.
Sure. How long were you preaching in Washington?
10 years.
Okay.
And one of the things I found is my major evangelistic approach is using the big picture of the Bible. I've been doing that for about 15 years. Okay. And the major reason for it is, the focus is on teaching people about Christ and the gospel and pricking them in their hearts about their sin and understanding why Christ had to die. And I think sometimes we kind of assume that people got that, and so we want to talk about other areas doctrinally that maybe they haven't understood, like baptism for the remission of sins and things like that. I just think it's a real mistake not to follow the Bible example and teach people to cleave to the Lord and to love God and be an expert as much as we can on sharing the basic gospel. Mm-hmm. And that's what the big picture of the Bible does. And so because of that, it's very powerful. And in many cases, it's the first time they've ever heard it. They're very smart, but they've been secularized, and they haven't had an occasion to really know that much about the Bible. And many people think it's filled with a bunch of myths and misinformation. But just listen, hear the gospel. And I've been surprised how many people, after just an hour presentation of the gospel, done with passion and sincerity and clarity, it's like, wow, this is amazing. And they're not atheist anymore. The presentation of the gospel itself is so unique and powerful that in and of itself becomes a way that people can believe. Mm-hmm. And C.S. Lewis was that way. He wrote this little book called Surprised by Joy. If you haven't read it, it's really interesting.
It's on my shelf. I have not read it.
Yeah, well, basically what he says is he was an atheist. He was that real smart Oxford scholar. Mm-hmm. And he originally just was out of curiosity trying to examine the Christian faith and was basically going to try to poke holes in it. Mm-hmm. But the more he looked at it, the more he finally realized, wow, could have made this up? Would this make sense? What would be the motive of somebody making something like this up? And this idea that the Creator, God, the Spirit, would come down in human form, whoa, at any rate, it made sense to him when he realized what sin was and then why this was the payment for the sin problem. And he just got this overwhelming sense of kind of an intellectual aha experience as he became a believer and joy in his heart. And he came at it from a skeptical perspective, not expecting to find that. But he was surprised by joy and became a believer simply by understanding the gospel. So I used to, if somebody said they weren't a believer, well, there's no point in me sharing this stuff from the New Testament with you. You don't even believe in God. I need to give some evidence lessons first, and then I need to show them the veracity of the New Testament text and the Dead Sea Scrolls and all these things, why we can believe in this. Mm-hmm. And now I just think, well, just out of curiosity, I want you to understand what the excitement is all about and where we're coming from. Can you give me an hour of your time? And sometimes that's all it takes. Mm-hmm. Suddenly their objections to God are no more, no longer. They just know this is true. And I think a lot of members of the church who've heard it all their lives don't really understand the power of somebody really hearing the full gospel and how it really fits together for the first time. So that's one thing. So I've had some success in dealing with people on that level. Still share the gospel even with somebody if they say they're an atheist. I'll take my time to do it if they're willing. The other thing is, when I was in San Diego, we had about 57 baptisms in 3 years. And I taught people how to use the big picture of the Bible and train them in it. And there were just so many people interested. On one occasion, I had 13 presentations and 13 responses, 13 baptisms in like 3 weeks. It was amazing. I had never seen anything quite like that. So it was a place where things were real receptive. Now, there were other times, of course, where I had a streak of no's, of course. So you add it all up, it was about maybe close to 40% response rate. And the church was just exploding. And then I went up to Kirkland, and I tried some of the same things. And I found that if I could get someone to sit down with me, the response rate was only about 15%. So what I learned from that is you can go up to the Pacific Northwest, you can get out of the Bible Belt, the church can still grow. You just have to work about 3 times harder.
That's what you learn, huh? Just have to work about 3 times harder.
Yeah, and so we had like 80 plus baptisms in the 10 years I was there, and the church more than doubled. And it was a great place to work, but beating the bushes and trying to get people to listen. The other thing I found culture-wise is that I would ask waiters, waitresses, guy who cut my hair, all these different people that would agree. I would get a very large percentage of people who, when I'd give them a little big picture card and tell them about it and say, would you like to hear this presentation? I'd say a good 40% of the people would say yes. Well, that's about what I got in San Diego. But they didn't mean yes. Mm-hmm. It's a culture where they're being polite. And they're even willing to give you their cell phone and their contact information and their email. But when I get back with them, they act like, who are you again? Mm-hmm. And no, I don't want to do this. Well, I wish they'd just tell me no. They're not interested, just say so. Don't tell me you're interested. Get my hopes up, and then like I'm the bad guy for following up. Mm-hmm. And it happened about 80% of the time. Something in the culture. They call it they're kind of got this external politeness where they don't want to say no, so they say yes, but they don't really mean it. Mm-hmm. And I found that just so frustrating. To the point where somebody would say yes, and I'll say, you really mean yes? I go, I'm willing to take my time to share this with you, but only if you really are interested. Are you really interested? Well, not really. Okay. Thanks for being honest.
Yeah.
I felt kind of rude doing that, but it was like, that's the culture I was in.
You had to pull out honesty out of them.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh,
and so every place you go, it's a little different.
It's a little different. But what would you tell, because I'm really harping on the gospel lately as well. How do you tell someone who's never heard the gospel? What do you tell them? Like, what is it?
Well, it's an hour presentation.
Yeah, don't give me an hour.
Can you give us the nickel tour?
The nickel tour.
Give me first
the reader's
Are you familiar with Ken Craig's The Big Picture of the Bible?
I'm not.
Okay, you need to get familiar with that.
Okay.
It's a little booklet. Came out in 2009, mm-hmm. and it's sold over like 100,000 copies. And
my parents gave me that when I got Wait, no, we did a Bible class on it at my last congregation.
Oh, thanks for not telling me about it.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the research.
Really good book, though.
Yeah. The other thing that's fascinating is I've seen churches buy the tract or the little booklet and just put it out for people to pick up and read, and hardly anybody ever will just sit down and read this and say, "Oh, this is clear. This is what I need to do." But if it's presented and you have good eye contact and good passion, and people can tell you care about them, and you kind of observe how they're absorbing it, and if so, adjust the message a little bit to make sure they get it. A very large percentage of people, it's just, I've had people stop and say, "This is amazing."
Cool.
So to make a long story short, it's kind of funny you ask, because both of you know very well what the gospel is. You talk about, a little bit about the Bible and how it's such a unique book, and it's not really one book, but 66 books, and these men were moved by the Holy Spirit, and, God breathed and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And then you start off with Jesus, who, the last words were, "Before I go up into heaven, I want you to preach this good news, the gospel, to all creation." It must have been pretty important if that's the last words he said before he left this earth, right?
For sure.
And then the rest of the Bible there in the New Testament, especially the book of Acts, is showing how the gospel spread. And in the book of Acts is 40% sermons, so it's also showing us what was said to those people who needed the gospel. And so you can learn a lot about what we ought to be stressing simply by looking through the sermons in the book of Acts. And they focus on the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus and why that's important and what that means. You get to Acts 17, you get a little bit better, different approach, because there he's talking to pagans, not Jews, who didn't understand about God. So he goes back and starts talking about the unknown God that you worship and you don't even aware of who he is, So all those things. But, the lesson just, takes them through the gospel, how it's something that you have to not just hear, but you have to believe. It's not enough to just believe it. You have to obey it. And what does that look like? And a lot of people don't realize that the gospel is the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 and 2. And that there's a unique way in which you can obey the facts of the gospel. And so George Washington is the first president of the United States. I can believe it, but how do I obey it? So listen very carefully, because at the end of this presentation, we're going to talk about a unique way that you obey the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So you take them through all of this and why he's the solution to the sin problem, and how people in sin are without hope, and the 10 Commandments will keep you out of jail, but it won't get you to heaven, and all these kind of different things.
Yeah.
And then finally at the end, you just show them that in Romans 6 that they were told that this is, this form of doctrine from which you've been delivered, and that this is how you obey the gospel. You'll participate in a form of the death, burial, and resurrection, which is really baptism. And that's why this is for the remission of sins. That Jesus shed his blood in his death, and so this is how you get into his death. You're baptized into his death. So that's where you contact his blood. That's why that's so important. It's not that you're saved by baptism, independently of faith and repentance, but this is the point at which you contact his blood. There's a connection between the blood and the baptism, and you show them in this lesson how the same thing that's said about blood is said about baptism. And so a lot of times people go, "Oh,
right.
It's really God's work. It's not man's work." It's easy to ask someone to baptize you. This idea that, works have nothing to do with salvation. Meritorious works have nothing to do with salvation. But good works are something you do after you're saved, I agree. But he's talking there in Ephesians 2, 8, 9 about meritorious works, nothing we can do to deserve it. That is still true. But if you can understand that the children of Israel in the Old Testament, that they had to submit to God's work of parting the Red Sea, which was a mighty work. but they had to walk through it and then get to the other side and rejoice. They submitted and were obedient to God's work. And so he has something similar today. That's what this is. It's submitting and believing in God's work.
It's an act of faith.
As an act of faith.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That's what I've been harping on. Yeah.
Yeah, as an act of faith. And so you take away the objection that people have that this can't be that important because works have nothing to do with salvation. You got to realize where they're coming from and kind of break that paradigm. And I think this lesson does that just in a masterful way.
Yeah.
And so you just get a chance to share it. It takes about an hour. And, you know, most everybody finds it fascinating because where are you going to hear it these days?
Sure.
The true gospel has been changed. You know, baptism is not the gospel. Baptism is the response to the gospel. But people have changed the way you get into Christ and made up this idea of you just ask him into your heart. Mm-hmm. And so many people sincerely think that's true. And so then they have this emotion that, oh, I did what I was supposed to, and now I think I'm saved. And that's a very sensitive subject. And without really being critical of other religions or being negative in any way, it's just a positive presentation of the simple gospel.
And then that pattern continues even after baptism of death, burial, and resurrection. Right, I would say so. If I look at, Peter in Galatians when he's being corrected, and Paul says, "You are not in step with the gospel," which means I'd say he's not walking in step with the death, burial, and resurrection. Mm-hmm. And in that context, he's talking to the Jewish people who are trying to add to the gospel, and. So he's not putting to death that thing there.
It seems to always be constantly called upon too. Peter even says, I'm trying to stir you up by way of reminder. And Paul even says that this is a continual renewing of your mind. So it's that this is a constant thing that we have to keep doing. Yeah. Keep refocusing.
Yeah, but if you talk to the typical Christian, somebody's a friend of yours and they're on their deathbed and the doctor says, I'll give you 1 hour to talk to this person and then he may not be long for this world. Okay, if you had 1 hour to share the gospel with somebody, what would you say? Kind of like what Paul told the Philippian jailer, the same hour of the night. I think every Christian ought to have a pretty good grasp of, what you're going to tell somebody that you've thought through that gives them the truth that sets you free. And so I try to teach people how to use these flip charts, which go through the big picture of the Bible. Then I can duplicate myself. And then you focus in on how many presentations you've made, say, in a month. I don't think you ought to have baptismal goals because that's God's work. I don't know who's going to respond and who's not. That's not my work. My work is to sow the seed. And so I just think we ought to get back to sharing the gospel. Yeah. And then later on, after they're in Christ, now you want to be a part of his body, none other. You want to be a part of the church you can read about in the Bible. That's the time to start talking about the church and why it's important. But first they have to fall in love with the Lord.
Mm-hmm. That's well said.
That's good stuff. That's good stuff.
Should we do our question?
Well, I think that's an episode in itself. What do you think?
Was that 10 minutes?
Yeah. Do you have some more time, Brent?
Yes.
You do?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to do a second episode and talk about that. Sanctity of life. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
What we would like, are we still rolling?
Yeah, we are still rolling.
Okay. Well, so we typically ask all of our guests a question, which is the namesake of the podcast, and I'm springing it on you, so take a deep breath. But
it's a trick question.
Matthew 5-7, Jesus gives his great Sermon on the Mount, and is introducing to us a way of following after God, and a way that these works, these meritorious works, how we are changed. We're not the same. And he gives a series of instructions. If someone strikes you on the cheek, turn the other cheek to him. If they sue you for your shirt, give them your coat also. And one of the instructions is if someone forces you to go a mile, go with them too. And in that way, it might bring them pause. Well, you don't have to go another mile. So when we say the extra mile, it's a way for us to bring people almost to question their own motives if they cause us harm. And so in Jesus's instruction of telling us to go the extra mile, how would you put that in your own words? In either speaking to someone without or to someone within, how can we go the extra mile for our fellow man?
I think Jesus is saying, be willing to do more than what's fair. I think that's going the second mile. Mm. In the context of, that day, there was a law on the books that allowed a Roman soldier to just countermand some Jewish slave, and they were all slaves under the Roman boot, right? And the Roman Empire, and you could just tell somebody who's out in the field, I need your help right now, you carry my bag 1 mile. Mm-hmm. And it was one of the things the Jews really hated, as you might imagine. Mm-hmm. Like no respect for their workday or what they're doing, and that was what the law required. And so you could be thrown in jail if you did not carry this Roman soldier's bag. And so they hated that. And they're asking Jesus, what do you think about that? And he shocks them by saying, well, change your attitude about this and go the amount you're supposed to, but don't do the minimum. Tell this person, okay, do you need me to go another mile? I don't have to, but I'll do that for you if you need it. Now, what kind of impact is that going to have on the person who resents this law if you're willing to do more than what's fair and go the second mile? And the other person is the Roman soldier. What? Why would you do that for me? Mm-hmm. Do you think that would, maybe bring about some conversation? Do you think that would break down prejudice? Do you think that would help the situation more than harm it? I think it would help the situation. So it's really interesting you asked this, because my very, very first sermon as a young teenager was on the second mile.
Okay.
So it always has a special place in my heart, because that's what I talked about, a little 10 or 12 minute talk. And I was intrigued by it.
Okay.
And I think we all need to be willing to bend over backwards, not to be resentful, not to be bitter, even if somebody's imposing upon us in a way that really shouldn't be. This is the situation I'm in. I need to learn to be content. And maybe I can even reach this Roman soldier and we can become friends.
Yeah.
And that would be a good way to do it. And I imagine the conversation with this Roman soldier was like, what? Why would you do that for me? Well, then you can talk to him about the kingdom. Mm-hmm. But we come not to be served, but to serve. And we're on a spiritual plane, not a physical plane. And we're not some threat to you like you think we are. Now, what if everybody had that spirit, that attitude, could turn the world upside down, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what the early church was able to do that in many ways we're not doing very well today. They won the hearts of the people. They did things that demonstrated their faith far beyond just teaching them the truth and pointing out their sin. My understanding is that during the bubonic plague, for example, that a lot of the people would throw the people out on the street as soon as they were infected, because they didn't want to be infected, and they just left them out there to die. And the Christians were well known for finding these people in their suffering and taking them home, putting themselves at risk, but do good unto all men, right? Especially the household of faith. Mm-hmm. And saving these people just like they would save these little infants that were suffering from exposure and left out to die. And the Christians would save them and then raise them as their own. And then they'd learn about what happened and how the pagans had left them out to be sacrificed, and the Christians raised them up. And they became some of the most passionate missionaries anywhere, talking about the love of Christ and how they wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for their love for me, a person that's a perfect stranger to them. They raised them as their own. So, the fact they would be willing to give up their life for Christ when they're thrown to the lions, and instead of being concerned about trying to do something that might get the Caesar, whoever it was, to change their mind about them, being executed that day. They would be praying for the people in the stands, and they would show concern for the people that would do such a terrible thing to them. And they would literally do what they could to preach the gospel from the arena. And in several cases, I'm told the lions went up, and they're starved, right? They're hungry. Mm-hmm. But they respond to fear. If you run, they'll run after you. And if they can tell you're afraid, then that just further empowers them. But these people were not afraid to face death. And these ravenous lions would come up, and they could sense that they weren't fearful, and they'll kind of walk around and smell and walk away. And the people in the stands knew that person wasn't afraid. And then they get done with watching this, and they say, there must be something to this Christianity. Are you kidding me? I need to learn more about this. And before the Edict of Toleration and all that, 40% of the city of Rome had been converted. And a lot of it was because of what the Christians could witness as a martyr in the Colosseum. So what was meant to be a way to completely stamp out Christianity was one of the Christians' major ways to evangelize. And they were willing to give up their life for this witness. Now, how many of us have that kind of spirit? How many of us even think about not worrying about suffering or death if it's going to bring about the salvation of souls and an opportunity to witness to maybe, 50,000 people in the Colosseum or something? Mm-hmm. I mean, wow. I mean, they won the hearts of the people. And I in my own life, I'd be the first to admit, what am I doing to demonstrate in a powerful, practical way my faith like the early Christians did?
Yeah.
So we want to restore the New Testament church. It's one thing to restore the structure and the organization and the name, and all that matters, but what's more important is restore the spirit. Let's restore the spirit of New Testament Christianity, the spirit of New Testament evangelism and of sacrifice and of holiness and of hospitality. That was the thing that made the difference. It was the lifestyle and the love that they would show toward each other and their brother. And then it's like the actual doctrine, the structure came after that. But we want to, distinguish ourselves from denominations and teach the truth about these things. But in many cases are just as comfortable and involved in the world as people of the world, know. And we just have to really spend some time thinking about our commitment and what can we do to go the second mile to do more than what's fair, to demonstrate it's not about fairness, it's about love.
That's awesome.
Well, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question as to how is the church? You mentioned the church isn't doing today as good of a job as that, or failing as that, and how so? But I think you touched on it. So, unless you want to elaborate on that, you don't have to.
Well, when I teach on restoration, I divided it up into two parts.
Yeah.
The first is I go to Josiah's restoration movement. And talk about how God was pleased with him returning back to the law more completely than any other king. And that way he was the greatest. And you can look at the text, and there's 6 things that he did to bring about restoration. But the problem was, after he got done, when he died, the nation completely went back to idolatry and immorality. They were only doing these things because the king had commanded it, not because they did it from the heart. And so what we've got to do is make sure that we don't stop at just trying to restore all the checklist items. We've got to make sure, as I said, that we have what I call the second restoration, which is harder. I think the first is really not that difficult. Where's the Bible example, even from the history, we can find out the way the church functioned, and we can restore the structure. But restoring the sacrifice and the commitment and the zeal and the attitude and the evangelism, all those things you see in the early church. I mean, the early church was a persecuted church. Mm-hmm. He who lives godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. I mean, if we were really out evangelizing like they did and boldly speaking the truth, I think there'd be more persecution. But we're pretty easily shut up, I think. We turn on our dimmer switch. We don't want to offend anybody. We don't want to rock the boat. They weren't worried about those things. It was all about souls. And I'm going to at least try. And I'm going to serve these people like they've never been served before. Even at the point of risking my life by taking someone in. You know, when I was in Kirkland, there was somebody who was homeless and nice fellow, and I set up a study with him. He was sleeping in his car, and he obeyed the gospel, and we became friends. And my wife and I had a nice home with a couple extra bedrooms, and winter's coming, and it's cold. And our friend Sean, who had been a member of the church, now he had joined our church family. You know, he didn't ask, he didn't complain, but we just felt terrible about Sean being out there sleeping in his car, and the elders let him park his car in our parking lot. And I just told Gail, I said, honey, this just isn't right. And she said, well, this is kind of risky. I said, well, yeah, but he's not like some stranger off the street we picked up off the interstate. This guy's obeyed the gospel. I think it's sincere. I've come to know him. If this isn't the least of these, my disciples, I don't know what is. Some poor person who's got a good heart, but he's down on his luck, and he was waiting on tables, and he lost his job, and COVID hit, and a lot of this stuff was just beyond his control. He was not into drugs. He was not into stealing. Never did any of that kind of stuff. And so we called and said, Sean, we don't want you to be cold. We want you to come, and we've got a nice warm house, and we've got a bed for you. And we just felt like maybe this is a test. Am I going to stand at judgment? And God says, wasn't Matthew 25 pretty clear here? Mm-hmm. But respectfully, my elders and most of the people in the church there that are mostly engineers and software engineers and Boeing, I mean, upper middle class, super educated with it people, they thought my wife and I were nuts. And why would you put your wife under such risk? You don't know what's going to happen there. And I said, this isn't some person off the street. This is our brother. And I try to ask myself, what would Christ do? And I don't think he would have let him be out there in the cold on a winter night. And he turned out to be a wonderful guest. And we finally had to tell him he had to leave because our landlord heard about it and didn't want this person there that wasn't on the lease. We were just renting. But he was so thankful that we stayed. And he traveled down to Tampa. He's now a truck driver making a very good living. He's taught his girlfriend. They're faithful. He got married at 58 for the first time. And she got married at 61. And I performed their wedding ceremony. And the point is, I was so surprised how people looked at us like you're taking on too much risk. That's going too far for having a person that doesn't have a roof over their head live with you for a while. And I'm not saying that to pat myself on the back. I've only done that once. Shame on me. But we don't tend to have that kind of willingness to outreach. It's like if it becomes too inconvenient or too risky, then that's where I draw the line. And I just think it was an application of Matthew 25. And one of the first people that called me after the hurricane was Sean Ryan, checking on me, wanting to make sure I was okay. And he's become a friend for life. And he has a spiritual question. Who does he call? So I'm continuing to disciple him and his wife. Now, what if more people were willing to serve on that level? Yeah. What kind of a difference would it make? I think it would make a huge difference. And it would be a spiritual restoration. So I look into my own heart. I've not always done everything I think I should do in that regard, but We need to be serving people and showing our love for Christ and proving it in that way and kind of plowing their hearts and make them open then to the message. What makes you do this?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
You do it for God, and you do it because Jesus loved us.
Yes, yes. And it's okay that there's some risk.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the early church, becoming a Christian, you risked being executed. Mm-hmm. You know, being thrown in prison and then thrown away the key, or actually throwing you to the lions. They weren't worried about risk. They went the second mile.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think we need to try to stress how important it is to really be committed and demonstrate Christ-like love to other people. And then be ready as soon as they're open to share the gospel with them.
That's really good. That's really good.
So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
It does.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll put a pause here for a second, then we'll just start again here. If that makes sense. That's good. With that, go so. If you want to know more about the Bible or you have any questions, our email is in the description below. You can DM us. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're looking for a church family or you're in the Lubbock area, we invite you to come visit and hang out with us in Milwaukee. We love for you to find a church who practices the love of Christ.